conflict or computer viruses. The real point is not to prevent you from getting a nuclear weapon. The real point is to have the world play out in a very, the international relations play out in a very different way than they're playing out now. So,
yeah, I think you're right. This is, it's a risky game that Israel and the U.S. are playing. On the one hand, I think the feeling is that these efforts, for instance, the cyber warfare is a way of setting back the Iranian program without having to take military action. So essentially, it creates more time for regime change or simply for a diplomatic process to take place. On the other hand, you're right. You're prodding. It's not just cyber, it's also attacks on assassinations of scientists. You are prodding the Iranians, and you don't know when and how they're going to respond. I mean, the Iranians did respond with some terrorist actions against diplomats. It seems like they were kind of clumsy and unsuccessful. But I think you can never control this process of tit for tat and ratcheting up. The other argument for these things is that, especially the sanctions, is that you are pressuring Iran to come to the table. That essentially you're causing Iran pain as a result of its nuclear program, and therefore you're giving Iran an incentive to want to end that pain by cutting a deal. I think that people can debate this argument. I think that there may be some validity to it, but one concern I think I have about it with the increasing ratcheting up of sanctions is that these only effective, seems to me, to produce these. Now we're going to have coming very, very tough sanctions, oil embargo from the U.S. and Europe, cutting off the Iranian central bank. This stick of these very tough sanctions is only, it seems to be effective if you have the potential carrot of the ability to remove those sanctions, right? I mean, you have the sanctions, you have to be able to say to the Iranians, well, if you do what we want, we will actually remove the sanctions. And one of the things I worry about, especially with this Republican Congress, is that even if there were a nuclear deal, the Congress wouldn't actually be willing to remove a lot of these sanctions. I mean, first, for one thing, even if they got rid of their nuclear program altogether, we have other reasons to be upset at Iran besides their nuclear program, right? They have a terrible human rights record. They support Hezbollah and Hamas, which are terrorist organizations. And so you could easily imagine a situation in which the Obama administration cut a deal and said, okay, our part of the deal is we're going to start to remove some of these sanctions as you do what you want. And then Congress said, we're not removing these sanctions anyway. And I think that actually inhibits our ability to actually get the diplomacy we would need to ultimately stop Iran short of nuclear.
I think it's absolutely true. The United States and Israel and Iran are all in a soft war against one another. It goes both ways. The sanctions are a form of economic warfare. We have Iran's use of terrorist proxies. We have these sort of these strange efforts to go after diplomats by Iran. We have drones getting shot out of the sky that the U.S. sent over Iran. This is very clearly a soft war, and the cyber attacks, I think, may have bought us a little bit of time, but the genie is now out of the bottle on cyber warfare. And I think long term, for the small amount of time that we may have bought regarding Iran's nuclear program, the long-term impacts are probably going to be potentially pretty devastating. And that's a form of warfare that we haven't explored. There aren't deterrents. We ourselves are very vulnerable to. So I think that that's all something we need to be mindful of. But it shows how insane this idea is that we can't talk to Iran. That, for as long as we were engaged in the Cold War with the Soviets, where we actually had the nerve to call it a Cold War, we were actually talking to the Soviets. And we actually had mechanisms in place to ensure that that things wouldn't escalate into something much worse. Whereas with Iran, we politically, it's it's extremely damaging for figures to support diplomacy, or it has been in the past. You've had military officials, U.S. military officials, like the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, who went around the country talking about how dangerous it is that we have no direct line of communication with the Iranians, so that if something goes wrong in the Persian Gulf, things could clearly escalate out of control and we would end up at war. This is another reason why we need to reevaluate our approach to diplomacy and recognize that diplomacy isn't a matter of giving the other side a gift, and it's not just a means to resolving a conflict through non-military means, but it also serves our immediate interests and our immediate security interests by providing a short circuit for any potential escalation into military action. So we definitely need to pursue a more robust channel of communication, and this is not just on the United States side. I mean, Iran is equally complicit in not being willing to talk to the United States, and under Obama there have been efforts to open up these channels, and the Iranians have largely rebuffed them. So, I'm not trying to lay blame on the U.S., but I think as far as our political culture, to make diplomacy such a tough policy to support really undermines our own security and is something that deserves a serious reevaluation.
Let me just push you guys a little bit before we go to the questions from the floor. Peter, speaking about the Israeli, you can call it obsession with the Holocaust and psychology, there's also the notion that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Clearly, you can say what you want about whether Ahmadinejad has real power. There is money and weapons flowing into enemies of Israel that are making life very difficult for citizens of Israel, that puts pressure on its politicians, regardless of that psychology. And certainly there's ample evidence that they do have real enemies out there. And I would also, ask you to consider there are many people in this country, and some people with power and influence, who don't think the war in Iraq was the wrong idea. It might have been executed poorly, but that Hussein is gone. The world is a better place without it. And why not the same thing to folks who are in power in Iran? Yes, it might cost a lot, but at the end of the day, maybe the world's a better place with that change, no matter how hard it is to get there. And those people will go back and say, if only we would have done that in the 1930s. Now, that's a big what-if game historically, and nobody really knows, but there's some comfort that people can draw for themselves and say, some things are worth fighting for, and some people just, you gotta take them off the stage. So let's try to do this quickly and then turn to the cards.
I mean, I do think that an Iranian nuclear weapon represents a threat to the state of Israel. I don't think it's an existential threat, because I think that the behavior of the Iranian regime has not been suicidal. Just to give one small example, Iran has supported groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, but it has not given them biological or chemical weapons. It has not gone, if Iran had been trying all these years simply to kill as many Israelis as possible, wreak as much havoc as possible, it could have done much more than it has. I think it's actually acted as a regime that has an ideology like the Soviet Union did, like Communist China. Remember, Stalin and Mao had nuclear weapons. But this regime has actually been concerned about self-preservation. They've been concerned about not doing things that would have produced such a ferocious response on the part of Israel or the United States that it would have imperiled their regime survival. And in that view, I think that's a view which is fairly widely held inside of the Israeli security establishment. I mentioned that Ehud Barak has said this. The head of the Mossad at the time of Ricardo has also said that Iran is not an existential threat. But I do think that Iran is a threat in the sense that an Iranian nuclear weapon would lead to Iran being empowered regionally, and I think that would translate into into groups like Hezbollah. Hamas, perhaps as well, though Hamas and Iran seem to have been a little bit distanced from one another recently, but I think you can imagine a situation in which Hezbollah felt emboldened by an Iranian nuclear weapon. I don't think that Hezbollah would be immune from Israeli counter-response. I mean, during the Cold War, we still had all kinds of proxy wars, even though the Soviet Union had a nuclear weapon. But I do think you can imagine a situation in which Hezbollah is emboldened, and Hezbollah can make life really, really miserable for Israel and kill a lot of Israelis. So I think Israel has every incentive and every rational incentive to try to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, as does the United States. But ultimately, it also comes back to you come back to the question. I don't think either Jamal or I are saying that an Iranian nuclear weapon is nothing to be worried about. I think the real debate, it seems to me, is really about what is the best way of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And I think on that score, I think there are many people, even who do take the threat quite seriously, who simply don't think that military action is a good idea. I mean, former Israeli Mossad head Meir Dagan, who was in charge of the Iran portfolio for 9 years, is no dove, no passing. This is the guy who oversaw all of these process of cyber warfare, assassinations, and all kinds of stuff. And he said that he thought a military attack was the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And he didn't say that because he's a pacifist. He said it because he thought it would be counterproductive.
You know, if you're arguing that the Iraq war was a success, we may not be able to come to an agreement. But when I talk about the worst case scenario of an invasion of Iran and 1 million troops, we're talking about Iraq times 4. And if we're just talking about strikes on Iran, like the Osara example, you know, that actually we found in 1991 after after the Gulf War, and inspectors went into Iraq. We found that Saddam actually reconstituted his nuclear program, on a far more massive scale, and was much closer to having a nuclear weapons capability than he had ever been before. And had he not, slipped up and gotten himself into a war with the United States, we would have never found out about that, and Iraq likely would be a nuclear weapons state. So I don't think that there have been any successful instances where we can compare Iran to Iraq and say, yes, we should follow that example.
So now I'm going to go to the questions we got from the floor, and you started to touch on this, but I'm going to ask you to expand on it. If Israel did, find a way, to bomb the Iranian nuclear facilities, what would likely be the military consequences to Israel from Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and what is the likelihood of any such provocation drawing the United States into war?
So it's nobody knows for sure how Iran would respond. There's a potential that Iran would respond by lobbing missiles into Israel, potentially trying to strike Israel's nuclear facilities. There's a likelihood that Iran would activate, proxies, potentially use Hezbollah, and Ehud Barak has said, only 500 Israelis would die. We're not talking about 5,000 or 50,000. There's a possibility Iran would, mine the Strait of Hormuz, through which a large amount of our energy flows through, that would cause energy prices to skyrocket. There was even a recent Pentagon war simulation that found that one of the immediate reactions of Iran would be to strike at U.S. forces based in the region, and immediately, 200 U.S. soldiers would be killed, and the United States would be drawn into a war. And Iran has said that they would consider any strike by Israel to be a strike by the United States. However, I'm not convinced that Iran would want to enlarge the conflict and draw the United States in. And I think that actually more problematic would actually be if Iran were to not respond militarily. I think it's important to note that Iran's influence in the region is not military influence. It's subversion. It's influence through commonality in other states, and that they would likely be able to use this as an instance of, a strike by Israel against a country that doesn't have a nuclear weapon, hasn't tested a nuclear weapon, a country where intelligence agencies have said they don't even have a nuclear weapons program, basically a strike that would not be legal under international law, they would be able to use that to go to the UN to use whatever channels are available there to basically turn the tables and undo the isolation that the Obama administration has managed to cobble together regarding Iran, potentially undo those sanctions and increase the isolation of Israel and severely undermine any influence the United States has in the Middle East, whether it's in Egypt or whether it's in potentially solving the crisis in Syria. I think that approach actually would probably be the one where Iran could do the most damage, while at the same time having the cover to leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty, expel IAEA inspectors, and build a nuclear weapon.
I'm going to build on that and try to tackle the next question, because you just touched on it in PT. First of all, I mean, is there a likelihood that an attack wouldn't be viewed just the same way as Iraq or the attack in Syria, regardless of what evidence there might be? I think you could make a very good case that if the Israelis think that they can do it, and they do it, much of the world will simply, as they did with Osirak, I might say, you shouldn't have, but smile on the side and thank you for giving us more time, if that's all that it buys. So on top of that, there was another question here, questioning what might be viewed as a double standard between how Israel gets treated with respect to its, not being signatory to nuclear non-proliferation, and how Iran is being treated.
On the first question, there are certainly people who believe that some of the Sunni states in the Gulf and elsewhere might not be so unhappy to see an Israeli or Iranian military strike. One hears a lot about that. I've not been in those rooms myself, but there are those who say that the Saudis are as much pressuring the United States as hard to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and to be even open to military actions are the Israelis, because the Saudis are very concerned about Iran as their kind of regional adversary, a country that could be a kind of hegemon in the Gulf, the power, a Shia power in a historic, kind of in a conflict with Sunni states. So it's